What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Carnage, and the ending of this is gonna blow your mind. So check this out. This picks back up with Kenneth Neely basically abandoning Carnage, but also being kicked out at the same time, and traveling to go see Cletus Cassidy. Now, a little bit of catch up here because we haven't done Carnage for a little while. For those of you guys who recall, Kenneth Neely was a guy who was obsessed with the Carnage Symbiote, right? Just the violence of it all, just the horror of it all, but he saw it as more of like an artistic thing. And so what he did is he started effectively killing people in order to draw the Carnage Symbiote out. But the more time that Kenneth spent with the symbiote, the more time he realized he bit off more than he could chew. He didn't fully understand what he was getting into. But ultimately, John Shade, who was basically a cop that was hot on the trail of the symbiote itself, ended up basically being force merged with the Carnage Symbiote. We'll talk about that here in a second. But in an effort to find a way to defeat the symbiote itself, realizing that Carnage was effectively attaining godhood, Kenneth traveled to visit Cletus. Now, the funny thing about this is, remember, Cletus has a whole nother symbiote of his own, right? The Extreme Symbiote, Extrembiote, if you want to call it that. And the thing here is that Cletus Cassidy and the symbiote just kind of exist out there in the world, but because of the nature of the symbiote's power, Cletus can effectively alter reality in a localized space. So when Kenneth shows up here, he demonstrates yet again, he has no idea what he's doing, because when he starts talking to Cletus, he kind of introduces himself and says, hey, like, I was a huge fan of the Carnage Symbiote, and I'm a huge fan of you, and I did so many things to model myself after you, right? And one of the funny things about this is that Kenneth says, like, I'm like you, Cletus Cassidy, and the response of Cletus is, oh, I highly doubt that, Kenneth, right? I highly doubt that you are very much like me. And literally he says, I am like you, Mr. Cassidy. I'm an artist. I've transformed 33 people, exquisite little spirals in map and bone. And the response of Cletus is, 33? Well, Kenneth, that pretty much makes us family now, doesn't it? Right, 33 people. My gosh, Kenneth, you've killed 33 folks. Cletus at that point uses his powers over the symbiote to transform reality around them. And he says, like, this is a truck stop in Iowa, Kenneth, right? They bulldozed it shortly after I passed through here. I killed 49 people here. And here you are telling me how similar we are because you killed a whopping total of 33 people. Golly gee, Kenneth. How will I ever measure up? Right? It's just one of these amazing moments because Cletus Cassidy, and this is one of the coolest things, Cletus Cassidy has always been synonymous with Carnage. It's always been that way in Marvel. Cletus has his own origin story, but no one thinks about Cletus in relation to himself. If they ever think about Cletus, they think about Carnage. This is one of the first times in the history of Marvel when they actually start focusing on these two aspects of the same character in different ways, where Cletus gets focused on in one capacity and Carnage gets focused on in another. And in fact, that's one of the things that happens here. Cletus Cassidy actually takes offense at the hubris of Kenneth, that Kenneth would just show up where Cletus Cassidy is and say, I'm just like you, because like I've murdered a few people, right? The fact that he would compare himself to someone like Cletus, whose body count is in the thousands, right? The thousands. I mean, it'd almost be hard to keep track of the total number of people that have been taken out. And one of the things he says is, I don't usually have a problem with trespassers, and sometimes we even play fun little games. Of course, that's a reference back to like the content creator who showed up at the orphanage where Cletus resided and then didn't understand what he was getting into and Cletus killed him. If you didn't see that video that we did, make sure you check the link in the comment for the Cletus or for the Carnage playlist, because that story it's the best Cletus Cassidy story that I think I've ever read. And so what happens is Cletus immediately approaches Kenneth and says, do you have any idea what I've become, right? I'm going to unmake you, Kenneth. I'm going to pare you down right to the minerals. I'm going to scrape you out of this world. And it's really Kenneth coming to the realization he doesn't understand what he's getting into. That in his mind, the Carnage Symbiote being as crazy and bonkers as it was, that was just one part of the equation. That Cletus is more reasonable, more understandable. No, Cletus is insane. The Carnage Symbiote became the way it was because of the insanity of Cletus, right? Remember, whenever it comes to the symbiotes, they are kind of blank slates, if you want to call it that, when they're born, if you want to use that word. I guess born is a weird phrase. I mean, they literally get pooped out. But the thing about this is that when the Carnage Symbiote was just there, it bonded to Cletus. The only real emotion that it had was the shared hatred of Spider-Man that the Venom symbiote had, and it simply got that because it was procreated, right? So that hatred just kind of passed on. But outside of that, it was just a symbiote that was there. When it bonded to Cletus, Cletus, and Cletus' insanity drove the symbiote to insanity. That's how it is. So instead of Kenneth being in some situation where he's going to like the more reasonable person, he's going to the source of the insanity, having no idea what it is that he's about to do. And one of the things that happens is he beseeches Cletus and saying, no, but like the Carnage Symbiote is about to become God. It went to the realm of hell with Mistress Hela. It killed, or at least took out Malekith the Accursed, right? It's absorbing these different like codices, whatever those are, right? Because Kenneth doesn't fully understand them, right? But he's attaining these high levels of power, these artifacts that will increase what it is that he's capable of, and he's going to wage war against the universe and probably destroy it. And so before we end up finding out the response of Cletus, we end up jumping over to John Shade. Now remember, John Shade was the detective who was constantly trying to track down the combination of Kenneth and Carnage. Initially, it was him just trying to find Kenneth, but as Kenneth started allying himself with Carnage, it turned into a hunt for both. But the escapade and the desire to find the symbiote led John Shade on this just sort of journey and really this adventure that he had never considered before. He was a detective operating in New York, and like that was it, right? The worst he had to contend with was somebody like Kingpin. But then suddenly he was thrust into this situation where he's traveling to other dimensions, he's going to like all these places that he didn't even really know existed. And so his life in a lot of ways had been totally turned upside down. But remember, the one thing that the Carnage Symbiote basically respects more than anything else is tenacity, the desire to go after the thing that you want and to let nothing hold you back. And where Kenneth Neely was by all standards of measurement a coward, John Shade was not. And so that's why the entire time this story's been going on, Carnage has been keeping a watchful eye on John, so that when both John and Kenneth were in the same place, it kind of gave the Carnage Symbiote the ability to choose, and he chose John as his host. And so what he starts doing is going through his memories. He starts looking through his entire life to see what kind of man he really is. And one of the things he finds is an instance where his old partner, where John's old partner, had basically come across the Kingpin. And in fact, his partner was losing it on Kingpin himself. The reason for this being because of the fact that Kingpin had basically had like 4 states' witnesses killed in the span of 48 hours, which destroyed the police's case against Kingpin. Now, this happened while he was mayor, and a little bit of information here for those of you guys who don't know. Yes, the Kingpin did become mayor of New York. This came as a byproduct of a story that Marvel had done not too long ago called Secret Empire, where basically Captain America took out the entirety of the superhero community. It was amazing. I loved that story. Again, you'll find that linked in the pinned comment as well. Secret Empire was a phenomenal story. But what ended up happening is that in a situation where New York was kind of isolated, they were stuck in a place called the Dark Force Dimension, that Kingpin used his authority to keep the people of New York safe, knowing that in doing so, they would see him as a person who protected them in a way that nobody else could. Daredevil, Spider-Man, none of those guys. So when everything went back to normal, Kingpin ran for mayor, and achieving the loyalty of the citizens of New York, he won. So it was a really, really cool story. Ultimately, that ended in another story that was called Devil's Reign. But the fact here is that this instance where he's taking out state's witnesses, this happens during that time when he's mayor. He's almost untouchable. And so what ends up happening is John literally reels his partner in and says, no, trust the system. Trust the justice system. Like, goodness will prevail here. But it didn't. And the reason why is because John was living to a degree in a fantasy land. Now, even John himself admits he was younger, he was naive, and he trusted the justice system that he worked for, all the while oblivious to the fact that there are people out there like Kingpin who are just immune to justice, right? Who by whatever manner and whatever means, the contacts they have, the money they have, they're able to avoid any real punishment for the crimes that they commit. That John had seen the justice system as this fair, all-encompassing thing that would always ensure that good prevailed. This was reality. And the funny thing here is that his partner Clyde had a much better understanding of how the justice system worked than John did, and that ultimately, as Carnage points out, good didn't prevail. Nothing happened. The Kingpin just got away with what it was that he'd done, and that was it. Right, that was just the nature of the beast. And so in a lot of ways, John had kind of betrayed his partner. And so what it shows here, at least as far as Cletus Cassidy is concerned, is that the more, I guess no pun intended, shady version of John Shade is really just predicated on him understanding the way in which the world works. That the world is not a horrible, terrible place, but it's not a great place. The world is just apathetic. And it's just some people out there who try to do the right thing, but most people are just minding their own business. And if it doesn't affect them directly, Neely, they don't care. And that mindset allows a lot of terrible things to slip through the cracks. And so jumping back to Cletus Kasady and to Kenneth Neely, Cletus warps reality around them again to make it appear like they're in a diner so it can seem like they can have some kind of measure of genuine conversation. Have no illusion. Despite the fact that Cletus Kasady just seems very relaxed and he's just eating pancakes, I mean, he would kill Kenneth Neely and forget that he did it 10 minutes after doing it, right? Like, the value of life does not exist for Cletus Kasady, right? This guy lives his life by two rules: those he can kill and those he can't. And so what he does is he tells Kenneth to take him through his journey, which is to say, show me how it is that you did these people in, right? Show me what your artwork looked like. And so using the memories of Kenneth Neely, Carnage restructures reality and pulls up one of the crime scenes. And immediately, Cletus rejects it. He's just like, no, this is not Carnage. It's too neat. It's too structured, right? You got this body displayed up. You know a guy at a zoo and even laughed at him about it, right? Like, you know a guy who can give you like these like butterfly larvae that you can put inside so when somebody cuts it open that the butterflies emerge and that kind of thing. This is not Carnage, Kenneth. Carnage is madness. It's unrestrained chaos. That's what Carnage represents. If you really were anything like me, this room would just be full of dead bodies and people who were just screaming for their lives and in their final moments experiencing abject terror. That's what Carnage is. This is controlled. This is restrained. This is just a guy who's a copycat and a poor one at that. And being taunted by Cletus Kasady in that way, that Kenneth lashes out and then goes to slash the throat of Cletus and then runs, right? Takes off running. Now remember, everything that you're seeing here right now is manufactured reality. It's altered reality. There's nowhere for Kenneth to run to. He's still inside the house. He's still inside this symbiote that Cletus has control over and can make it look like anything he wants. And so there comes a point when, as Kenneth is running, that Cletus just appears to him. And it's just like, you seem to have forgotten your paintbrush, maestro, right? Like pulling up this scalpel that Kenneth had. And so at the end of the day, the question Kenneth has is, why in the world are you here, right? This is actually just like this amazing shift in the mentality of Kenneth, because one of the things that's the most overlooked about his character is that he is a manipulator in a lot of ways. In fact, Cletus even goes so far as to give Kenneth his own story and saying, once upon a time, me and Carnage really were the same person. We functioned in the same way, but ultimately we ended up parting ways. When I got the extreme symbiote, Carnage didn't really seem to like it that much, but I realized he was also restraining me. He was holding me back. Now, this is the story that comes in the aftermath of Absolute Carnage, where it basically shows how Cletus Kasady and the symbiote basically separated. But this also illustrates that when Iron Man had this symbiote that he was using, right? He was using one part celestial technology and one part symbiote as a new form of armor, that Cletus took it over. And when he did, it became his new host symbiote, right? The extreme symbiote, extrembiote, whatever you want to call it here. But the thing about it is that Cletus is almost taunted to a degree by Kenneth, right? Kenneth says, here's the problem though, Cletus, while you're here in your house and you're toying with people who are unfortunate enough to stumble across your path, the world's forgotten about you. The world doesn't remember you anymore. Whenever all these crazy situations unfolded where the Carnage symbiote and you along with it would just go on these crazy murderous rampages, nobody ever spoke the name of Cletus Kasady. They spoke the name of Carnage. They don't remember your madness. They don't remember your beauty or your chaos. The only thing you can do here is to show them, right? And so what ends up happening is Cletus basically redons the symbiote on himself and then leaves, right? Like literally leaves alongside Kenneth, and they end up traveling to what's basically a real world diner. And so in order for Cletus to give Kenneth a display of what Cletus himself is truly capable of what beauty and art look like to him, he goes on a rampage in this diner and just takes these people out in the most violent and chaotic way possible. This is very much a throwback to Maximum Carnage from the 1990s. And in fact, one of the things that happens here is that one of the guys inside the diner literally picks up his phone and goes to make a phone call to call 911. Now, what ends up happening is Kenneth steps in and says, no, we can't have you doing that here, right? Like, we can't have you doing that. My friend Cletus here has been locked up for quite some time and he's allowing himself for a kind of release. Now, this is an instance where Kenneth completely misunderstands the situation, because where he goes to smash the phone, Cletus snatches it out of his hand and says, no, do you still understand nothing of what we're doing here, right? Like, I am reminding the world who I am, that Carnage is not a better version of me, that Carnage is a poor man's version of me. I am the master, I'm the maestro, I'm the artist. I made Carnage what it is, and Cletus Kasady will be remembered again. So he tells this guy, pull up your phone, call 911. Like, I'm gonna kill you, like, I'm gonna take you out, but I'm gonna let you live a little bit longer so you can basically make this phone call, which he does. He alerts the authorities on what's going on, and then once the authorities become aware and they respond, then ultimately this guy's taken out. Now, as you will notice here, the art style shifts, and if you're familiar with Marvel Comics right now, you know exactly what this art style is. You know exactly what comic this art style comes from, because in the midst of all this chaos, Spider-Man responds, right? Spider-Man shows up here. Spider-Man says, okay, there's some major calamity going on. I've got to respond to this, and I've got to see what's happening. But it's not Peter Parker. Miles Morales responds to the chaos. Miles Morales is about to face off against Carnage. Not only that, Miles Morales becomes Carnage. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Cliffhangers. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.